While he was working his forepaws as fast as he could, with pauses for deep sniffs into the earth, he heard the loud clucking of a poult beyond the opposite wooden wall of the shed. He heard it as he heard the lowing of cows in the meadow waiting to be milked, as he heard the rooks in the lime trees, and took no heed of the clucking until additional rustlings and squeakings very near made him withdraw his head from the hole and look in their direction. To Snapper's wildest delight, he saw what hitherto he had only seen in dreams. Rats, many rats, struggling together as they dragged a chicken towards the corner where he was standing. In the commotion of flapping wings and squawking, the rats had not observed him until he was among them. He nipped one lightly with his teeth and drew back, quivering from ear-tip to tail-tip as it turned at him and gibbered. Before he could do anything, one had bitten him on the nose. Snapper leapt back in astonishment for about half a second, then with a growl of rage he ran forward and bit the rat across the back. The rat squealed, and the noise made him shake it furiously. Meanwhile, the other rats had abandoned the chicken, which was squatting on the earth, spread-winged and gaping. Without pause, Snapper darted after another rat, which turned on him and bared its teeth as it sat up against the wall of the shed and squealed. Snapper chopped it in his teeth, shook it as he had the other, and flung it away in order to get one more. Then, from the hole in the corner, from other holes around the base of the shed, and from the faggot stacks outside, other rats began to appear. They sat up on their hind legs and sniffed together, baring their curved yellow teeth. Snapper had disturbed the colony, which only 2 days before had finally abandoned, owing to hunger, their assault on the new concrete floors of the granary of the hunting stables. These rats swarmed out of the holes and formed a ring around the dog, gibbering and whispering among themselves, sitting on their hind legs and dropping again to run little distances on their 4 feet, then sitting up again. Snapper barked at them, but they did not run away. Then a big old buck-rat squeaked, and Snapper ran at it. The buck-rat let out a squeal, and all the rats ran to Snapper and began to swarm over him as they bit him. It was at this moment that the farmer, having heard the cries of the pullet and coming up in a rage from his farmyard, carrying his loaded gun in his hand ready to shoot the dog, saw the dog in the corner beset by more than 20 of rats, biting his legs and his ears, hanging on to the dead chicken round his neck, while he was snarling and turning always to snap and bite. So astonished was the farmer that he let out a shout, and raising his gun, fired both barrels together into the rats. When the assistant professor arrived at the farmyard a minute later, the first thing he saw was Snapper being nursed in the arms of the farmer's wife, while a farmer was standing among a group of neighbours, quite breathless, as he repeated again and again what he had seen. There were the 9 rats which had been killed, 3 by the dog, and 6 by the shot. "And not one pellet," declared the farmer, "had harmed a hair of the dear little dog's head, bless the little booty." But one of the lead pellets had cut the string which attached the chicken to his neck. The live chicken, which the rats had been dragging into the shed, had escaped, and was sitting on the tailboard of a cart, looking bedraggled and very subdued, but otherwise uninjured. "Yes, sir," the professor tells successive classes of students, "that's Snapper, the dog you've seen with me. That's the dog that ate his punishment. That's the original shaggy dog." It happened way back in Devon, England. Snapper is now a respectable, old, toothless gentleman dog, fed on slops, inclined to be a little stiff and portly, who has his own cushions and sets of rubber bones, and invariable ceremonies and ways of procedure inside and outside the house. Sometimes, however, as when the moon is full, he may go out on the campus and dig for imaginary rats under imaginary cypress trees, shaking them in imaginary teeth. The professor, after a shot or 2 of imaginary Scotch, talks of his imaginary masterpiece on the French Revolution, which one day he intends to finish. The sophomores, or freshmen, are not particularly interested in the projected masterpiece, however, but all of them want to know the reason why the professor refers in the course of his story to the dog who ate his punishment. Oh, he and Snapper went for a long walk, the professor tells them, and when they returned, the farmer's wife came up with a big plateful of carefully boned chicken, which she had prepared for the little dog from the poults which the rats had killed. The Maiden Salmon. Here lies the moor, wild with green bog and curlew's song in spring, grey with granite tors ceaselessly carved by the winds of centuries, the winds bringing Atlantic clouds, which in the cold air over rock and valley fall as rain and fill many rivers, flowing rapidly to the ocean again. In all the rivers, save those polluted by man with his mines and factories, salmon are born, and live their young lives a while before migrating to the sea, to roam in deep waters where only death or dream has taken men. And after several years they return to their native rivers in silver sea dress for the sake of love to spawn, and nearly all of them die there. One morning in the new year, a man was walking beside a thread of water which ran bright and clear under banks of carven peat. He walked on a path among rushes and granite boulders and soft green moss, a path used only by himself, by sheep, and wandering foxes. He walked alertly, hopefully, for the sun was shining and shadows of white billowy clouds were moving swiftly northwards over the moor. For weeks ice and snow had held down the life of earth and water. Now the south wind was bringing hope and renewal with the sun. Following his own path beside the runnel of water, he came into a wide valley, made during hundreds of thousands of centuries by water hastening to the sea. Here under the hills ran the river from which the moor takes its name, one of the most famous salmon rivers of the south. A score of paces before the junction of runner and river he stopped, and kneeling on a stone examined something intently, his face near the water. When he looked up, his face was alight with joy, for one of the salmon eggs in the tray, made of striped and charred withies of the dwarf willow lying on the gravel, had hatched. During the last summer, this man, who was a poet and an ex-soldier, had cut a channel through the turf and dammed the runner with boulders. A small pool was formed, and water flowed along its new bed. He made a wooden fender which could be lifted to regulate the flow of water, and a box of fine granite gravel placed inside the fender acted both as filter for silt and screen against any fish or water insect drifting down with the current. At the lower edge of the new channel he set a wooden box with a grill made of an old pail pierced with nail holes to stop entry from the river, knowing that eels and trout work upstream in search of food, especially if that food be salmon eggs. An eel quests for and works the food scents in a river as keenly as a hound after the quarry has been found. Then, in October, the rains fell, driving and drifting like smoke across the moor. And when they ceased, water cried night and day against the earth, faintly and trickle and string and bubbly splash through the peat hags of the higher ground, growing louder as it fell in rillet and cascade and swilling glide over and on the granite, until it roared down the valleys, a dark brown flood against which the salmon bored and leapt as they journeyed upwards to the spawning reds at the river-head. The man watched them, identifying himself with them. Water bailiffs, paid by the Conservancy Board to frustrate poachers with gaff, wire noose, net, and bomb, soon ceased to be suspicious of him, as day by day he stood by the fish passes in the weirs built along the lower beats of the river. To the watcher from the moor the fish were noble travellers, returning to the perilous river from the safety of deep Atlantic waters on the only true aristocratic impulse of life, the instinctive search for immortality through love. Joyously the salmon were returning to the stream where, during the first 2 years of their lives, they had worn the brown, red-spotted dress of little trout, growing therein hardly as long as a man's hand. Now, as mature fish, they rolled and played joyously under the weirs and waterfalls, strangely excited by the imminence of peril for love's sake. These fish feared shallow water, yet they swam on, boring away up waterfall and torrent, often to be hurled back and pounded against rocks, which bruised their bodies and broke their tails. Or they clung with paired fins to certain jags, which wore their scales away until the flesh was exposed. The poise of a salmon, the power of its accumulated sea strength, lies along its tapered length. Its flexibility is its life. It dreads each upward leaping into the stupendous solid power of water roaring over a high precipitous weir. It noses the water. It slides up and drifts back, exploring with its sensitive flanks again and again, until its own golden power or faith returns into its being, and it hurls itself out of the foaming pool and bores its way into that which gives it immortality. So the poet, lonely and proud in his own spirit, thought as he watched the autumn run of salmon ascending to the spawning redds on the moor. Weary beyond thoughts of crucifixion and resurrection, self-withdrawn in despair from the deathly ways of his fellow men, living beyond hope of human companionship since the realization in his 30th year that he had been born to love God, he yet lived and was upheld with faith, and in some way which he could not, nor indeed did he wish to, formulate. Salmon were of that faith. All he dare think to himself was that a fish was anciently the symbol of baptism, of rebirth, of heavenly consciousness. And did not Jesus say that this was love? Jesus, whose tears were clouds these many centuries. With such strange and incalculable feelings, the hatching bed was made in the runner high up on the moor, and a handful of salmon eggs from the spawning bed in the river transferred there, carried in damp moss. The eggs were the color of Californian grapes, a faint pinky brown. Lying still on the bank, he had watched the male fish taking the female's place in the hollow made by the sideways flaps of her body to shed his milt over the eggs, a pale cloudiness floating away in the water. A farmer had seen the fish there, too, in water less than 9 inches deep, so that their back fins and tails were in air. Next morning the red or spawning bed was empty. A pitchfork had killed the fish and lifted them out to feed the farmer's pigs in the farm on the hillside, a small grey building standing gauntly within a rectangle of starved trees, half ruined by wind. Very carefully the poet had put the eggs in a hatching tray and covered them with a hurdle made of willow and mountain ash wands to shut them from light and the scrutiny of birds. Then came frost and ice, and for weeks his own life was suspended with that life developing within the eggs. At last the warm south wind brought a thaw, and he waited in the sunshine for his own renewal. Against the lower end of the wicker basket he saw the broken egg covering turning and bobbing in the limpid flow of water scarcely an inch deep, which twirled through the spaces in the wickerwork. It was like a very small, colourless grape skin. There in the corner, hiding, was the baby salmon, an alevin, luminously opaque, no longer than his fingernail, a mite, with the egg sac still dependent upon it, now its belly. He touched it with the tip of a curlew's feather, and it wriggled swiftly across the tray with extraordinary speed. He felt his life glow within him as he covered the tray carefully to keep the light from its eyes, and rising, sang as he walked down the path to his hut. The next morning other eggs had hatched. With the curlew's feather he lifted the skins from the water, and several eggs which were an opaque yellow, sign that they were dead. The alevins wriggled rapidly, always head to stream, under the eggs to get away from the light. One wriggled more rapidly than the others, and he knew it for the alevin that had first hatched. Every egg was rolled over delicately with the tip of the feather and scrutinized for the slight furriness that meant the fungus of disease. The wicker tray, with its bars of withy almost touching, had been charred in the flames of his hearth, so that any fungus on them would be killed and any underwater growth prevented. Water wimpled clear over the unhatched eggs and the semi-transparent alevins pressed between them. He covered the tray with the hurdle and went happily to his hut on the knoll. Every morning he walked along the path by the runner to watch over the alevins and remove the old egg skins. After 10 days, all but 6 were hatched. These were still clear, they were infertile, and he lifted them up the side of the tray with the stiff edge of the feather and flipped them one by one over the lower screen. As the 6th egg struck the water, there was a slight bulging rise, made by the head of a cannibal brown trout, which for days had been waiting below the screen, drawn by the scent of salmon alevins. Seeing a blurred movement as the man stood upright, the trout sped away, making a ream or wavelet on the surface of the water. At the beginning of the 3rd week, nearly 100 alevins were pressed together in one corner of the tray. The quickest of the alevins, browner than the others, was the one he always looked for. It was the first to be hatched, and already its sac was shrinking into its body, and in shape it was almost a little fish. A water snail wandered into the sanctuary, and although it was small, its shell was several times the size of the holes in the screens. How came it there? He sought for holes and found one under the entry screen. He had omitted to clear away grasses and rootlets which had collected there, and this had caused the water to rise higher and to fall through the holes, cutting a pit under the lower framing of the screen. This he blocked with the turf which he firmly trod down. Afterwards he searched in the channel for any eel or trout that might have passed through. Next morning, when he lifted the hurdle, he saw something that made him start with inward anguish, for against the side of the wicker tray lay a small fish as long and broad as his thumb, with a squat, ugly, bull-like head, mottled and spotted with brown. It squatted there, holding to a blackened cross-stick with fins like yellow hands. And the right top corner of the tray where the alevins had huddled together was empty. The dwarf fish, eater of salmon fry, was alone in the tray. The poet felt the doom of his previous life on the world's battlefields, before he had sought purification by solitude in the moor, coming upon him dreadfully, and he turned away with a gesture of weariness, and lay on the sward with one arm outflung, while the water seemed to be flowing away with his life, leaving it vain and purposeless as the sky, which saw birth, growth, decay, and death with equal vacancy. He lay there while the shadow of rushes in the south-running water slowly drew into the bank, leaving the stream sun-clear and glassy. Footsteps brushing the heather made him look up, when the footsteps ceased. He looked into the clear eyes of a young girl, regarding him with steadfast gravity. The sun was behind her, her outline arose, slender and shining out of the moor. The flow of his life to the vacant sky ceased and returned to him as she came slowly nearer, her eyes losing the firmness of their gaze as she approached as though with doubt, yet their clarity remained. Lightly she came nearer, until she was leaning down over the narrow ribbon of water, staring at the tray with its misshapen occupant. Her clothes were poor and torn, her thin bare legs scratched with brambles, her mouth was large, her eyes were blue. Probably she was, he thought, the daughter of the farmer to whom salmon were a means for cheaply feeding pigs and manuring vegetables. And his eyes lifted to the gaze of her blue eyes, childlike and calm, with mental fearlessness regarding him. "They are gone," he heard her saying softly, and her eyes became wistful and her gaze fell. A thought came to him, overlaying the thought of her candid eyes and brow, that by her remark she must have visited the hatchery, that she had put the mull-head in the tray. The ignorant and destructive ways of men were inescapable. "Yes," he replied, and turned away from the sun. She was gone without sound. The poet sat up and looked sadly into the water, at the mull-head squatting there in the same place, replete, dull, gorged with its feast of the innocents. There was a glitter within the water as he shifted position. He peered down and put his hand in the water to pick up a small piece of metal, star-shaped, that appeared to be, as he examined it. But was it possible? Gold? And how came it there? A gold star? Then he glanced down at the tray where the dwarf had shifted when he had dipped his hand, and now was cowering in the corner. But it was not there he looked, but at a tiny fish which was poised vibrating gently behind the tail of the mull-head. He knew it for his own and firstborn, the alevin which now was a real fish, although scarcely more than an inch long, scaled, tapered for poise in water which flowed from the rock. The mull-head darted forward, and the little fish moved after it, keeping always behind its tail, the triumph of reason over massive strength, David defeating Goliath, life triumphant over death. And the gold in his hand was surely a symbol, a message of hope, like the morning star before sunrise. He scooped the mull-head, against which he had no feelings of anger or revenge, in his hand, and slipped it into the stream below the grill. There was a swirl in the water, and the olive-brown head of the cannibal trout showed in an instant, and then the stream flowed placidly once more. Sweet summer lay over the moor, with cirrus clouds in the height of the sky. Bees climbed happily among the honey bells of heather, and the murmur of water arose from among the feet of the hills. In the mellow evening light, water-flies rose and fell over the river, dropping their eggs from delicate long whisks below their gauzy wings, to fall, spent as the evening star glowed softly, the purpose of their lives fulfilled, to die as dreams of twilight and the everlasting compassion of death. The poet stood by the hatchery, while the rings of trout dimpled the river, and collected the tired flies and let them drift, void of life, on the glimmering surface of the channel. Gracefully the samlet, with a slow sweep of tail, rose and lipped the water. When the leaves of willow and mountain ash began to turn yellow, the samlet was as long as the man's little finger, a taper of golden brown spotted with black and red and dark smudges like thumb marks on its sides. It wore the workaday dress of a trout, like all young salmon, while the water spirit prepares them for the deep waters of the Atlantic, where they alone of fish are noble. But its mouth was smaller than a young trout of its own size, its head more shapely. When the poet leaned over the channel, the little fish, with a double fan-like wave of its tail fin, would swim up from the resting-place on the white gravel and take food from his fingers. When he was gone, it watched the water moving past for daphne, shrimp, and nymph of hatching waterfly, buoying itself in the gentle current. Or it slept, resting on the bed of the channel, against the peaty side, while its golden-brown colour dulled and its scales took on the hue of the peat. There it passed most of the winter, its being suspended with the life of the stream. In its second summer it grew longer than the man's middle finger, and it could leap easily thrice its length into the air after flies hovering there. Again at the fall, water ran everywhere down the moor slopes, gleaming grey with the sky of low and swiftly passing clouds. On a certain day and night in November, rain fell with a heavy steadiness that appeared to overcome all other elements, and the conquering roar of the spate filled the misty valley. The path by the runner was drowned. The runner itself was now a river, tearing down past the hut on the knoll with the speed of wild moorland ponies. For 7 days and nights the rain fell, ceasing only to assemble new darknesses of clouds, and the level of the spate rose and dropped back 12 times a day. Once, when he looked from the door of his hut, hazy with the smoke of a peat fire, the man heard a sound of whistling, like curlews crying, and saw the brown whiskered heads of 3 otters riding down on the flood, as they passed in their play of hide-and-seek amidst the unfamiliar hurly-burlies of the torrent. Rocks weighing many tons were undercut and rolled down the valley with dull, bumping sounds. And then the rain ceased, and the weak winter sun shone again, and within a few hours the water was running clear once more. The hatchery was gone. The old channel filled with rocks and gravel, the screens washed away. Where was the samlet now, he wondered forlornly? Perhaps in the sea, carried there before its time, or champed in the jaws of one of the cannibal trout which dwelt in the deep weir pools down the valley. Yet the poet had faith, and in his belief he set himself to clear the choked bed and to reset the dam of boulders across the runner by the channel inlet. A stone was placed where the top screen had stood, and water pouring over this carved a pool where the samlet had lurked before. In February, when the first flies began to hatch, small stone flies which as nymphs had built each around itself a shelter of stone specks cemented together with a doorway for their heads, he saw one morning a slight bulge in the water, and there, poised between the 2 converging flumes of currents, maintaining its stance with the least muscular effort, was his samlet, thinner and darker with winter fasting, but there it was, his darling fish, returned to him after the winter drear. So April came again, with the willow's hair drooping silver and green, and a solitary swallow playing in the light airs of the valley, while from afar came the voice of the cuckoo. Every day the poet came from his hut, where he was writing an epic of the Moor's ancientness and wisdom, to visit the samlet. In the last week of April it began to leap into the air and play on its side when it saw him. It became strangely excited as April ended her days. The golden hue of its scales gleamed brighter. It was changing its shape, too, growing longer, slimmer. Now the red spots were vanishing, and the black spots were as though washed away by the stream which was laving it with silver. No longer was it wearing its moorland dress of a trout, but before his eyes the water spirit was fashioning for it a sea-coat of newest silver. No longer was it a samlet, but a smolt, scaled with argent armour for its adventure down the river to the sea, and that journey beyond the submarine ledges where the last of Europe breaks away into the realm of deep waters, where only death or dream has taken men. Knowing the hour was come, he lifted the smolt from the water, fixed the star with silver wire to the little shortened rear fin on its back, and released it tenderly into the stream again. The next day, the pool in the channel was empty. Now every surviving Atlantic salmon, excepting an occasional straying fish, comes back to spawn in the river of its birth, from the unknown feeding grounds of ocean. Scientists who walk where poets fly do not yet agree how each fish finds its particular way home. Some say they return by instinct. Of the eastern Atlantic salmon, the short, deep tay fish return to the tay, the long, lean X-fish to the X, the heavy Y 30-pounder to that river which almost divides Wales. And the fish of the western Atlantic, meeting their eastern cousins after sea wandering of thousands of miles, go westwards against the slow, warm drag of the Gulf Stream, and each ascends its native river of the American seaboard. By instinct, say the scientists, every egg carries its potential sea route. Innumerable generations passed up and down this river. The habit was laid deep and eventually was put into the egg, like the habit of feeding, breathing, swimming, and the deeper functions of gills, blood course, and sight. This, they say, is instinct. By instinct the salmon returns. But the poet had seen eyed over of Tay salmon brought from Scotland to the extreme southwest of England, hatched in a Devon hatchery, planted as fry in a Devon river, and in time they returned not to the Tay but to the Devon river, short, deep fish among the lean native salmon. There was, he knew, in the salmon a beautiful natural memory of place, pool, bend, fall, and quality of water, which to him was divine. For nearly 2 years he lived and worked in his native cathedral city, inspired by thoughts and dreams of the fish which had gone down to the sea, bearing the star of gold into the blue twilight of its ocean destiny. He was known to be queer from the shocks of battle he had sustained. His friends were sympathetic towards him. He realized that he had to make his own adjustment to living, but the passionate few alone saw beauty in his face, akin to that of medieval saints in old pictures, and recognized a rare quality in his poetry. At the beginning of the 2nd April, after the Smolt's departure, the solitary young man was visited by a growing sensation of excitement and of the fateful imminence of an indefinable dread. After 2 years in the sea, he knew the salmon would be between 5 and 7 pounds in weight, and was likely to return to the river, a small spring fish. By the shape of the smolt he had known it was female. At that very moment his maiden salmon might be coming in from the Atlantic, travelling the route with others of its generation, which would bring the schools east of the headland, along the shingle banks under the cliffs, and round the shore of the next headland to the estuary of the river. The poet was almost to the climax of his epic, but he could write no further. He suffered mental anguish through doubt and confusion, which led to distrust of his inspiration, believing it to be self-delusion, his thoughts due to physical inactivity or frustration. A line in his poem seemed to stand out of the page. His tears are clouds since many centuries, and beyond that sorrowful truth he could find no pathway. That night, in sleep, he dreamed of his salmon, which glowed with unearthly radiance in the night of his vision. And awakening, he dressed, packed his rucksack, took his staff, and set out on the road to the moor and the sea, as the morning star was rising above the cathedral with its carved stonework figures obliterated by the rains and winds of 7 centuries. He walked throughout the day, resting at night at an inn, and the next morning went on his journey, arriving in the afternoon at the westward end of the shingle bank. Returning salmon were cruising through water a few feet from the shore, working round the coast, seeking the river, and along that shingle bank at intervals were fishermen with nets and boats, each waiting crew having a lookout man posted on the cliffs above the ruin of a fishing village washed away in one of the great storms which visit that coast once or twice every century. For days the poet waited, concealing his anxiety, friendly with the fishermen, yet aloof. Sometimes, as he stood by one or another of the watchers, he would hear a shout, see an arm pointing, cap in hand, in a certain direction. Men would appear out of the ruins of the village. They ran over the shingle. The small boat was launched, a net shaken over the stern, while 2 men rowed vigorously in an arc towards where the watcher was pointing. A shadow shape moving eastwards in the dim greenish water, a slim shape curving out of the sea less than an oar's length from the beach, falling back into its bubbled plunge and broken circle of whitish bubbles vanishing. The widening surge of ripples had hardly settled when the fish leapt again 20 yards farther on, to fall and smack the surface of the sea, thus hoping to rid itself of sea lice clustered near the tail. Many times the poet hastened down to the shore to see a fish dragged in by the net, and he trudged from boat to boat, asking permission to look under the squares of canvas lying high up on the shingle, covering the day's catch of each crew. On the 7th morning a new crew and boat appeared, rowed by an old man, his 2 sons, and his daughter. The poet watched her as they drew the boat half out of the water. Her thick, fair hair, bleached by the sun, was clustered short of her shoulders. Her arms and legs were bare, golden brown in the sun. She laughed with her brothers, tossing back her hair. She was strong in her sea grace. The child he had seen by the hatchery 4 years before was now a woman. The poet stood there, still and silent, stirred by her beauty, his thoughts cloistered apart from that which was of the realm of dream. Then, seeing him, the girl also stood still and silent for a moment, while he thought that never had he seen a brow so candid, or eyes so direct and clear, as though with the sky's clarity. A strange joy stirred in him. A shout far away to the westward. Another shout nearer, a third shout. There was excitement and movement among the boats on the beach, more shouting and waving arms from the cliff watchers and crews alike. Several fish had leapt at once. Again and again, leap after leap, curve and gleam and plunge, a large school was coming along the shore. One crew began to swear with agitation, for they had just shot a draught, and there were still many yards of net to be shaken and piled in the stern. 2 boats were already out, the men at the sweeps, pulling with all their strength. For fish in such quantity, scores and scores, the watchers had cried, were rare. Ah! The old greybeard was beating his hat on his thigh, for the middle fish of the school had turned and was going out to sea. "They'm coming back!" he roared, pointing his arm again, his hand trembling as though he would scoop them out with his hat. "They'm travelling your way!" Over the stern the father shook and loosened the folds of the net, which soon was hanging vertical in the water between the row of corks on the head rope and the leads on the heel rope. The boat described an arc to the line of shore, thus cutting off and enclosing an area to imprison fish. One after another, "leaping like greyhounds," in the words of the old man above, grey fish jumped over the curve of corks as the seine was drawn ashore. Grey mullet. They stopped rowing in disappointment. "'Twas salmon I seed, I tell 'ee," roared the greybeard, following his words with emphatic spittle. Then a salmon reamed along the water, and they bent to the oars again. The boat grated on the shingle. They jumped out and began hauling. The poet stood by, waiting with a feeling of his own life being drawn from him. The net was hauled less slowly as the sea drag lessened. The fishermen stared as they hauled, hand over hand, heels dug into the shingle. The boat lifted and scraped gently at the water's edge. The last of the net, the long purse, came in rapidly. Ah! 1 fish only. They were disappointed. The poet's heart beat so that his body seemed hollow with noise, weak to maintain itself standing. The solitary fish threshed the net in vain. A hand gripped it by the tail. It shook and curved, trying to escape. The poet saw a yellow sparkle in the sunlight, and his sight was instantly blackened. The fish was carried up the shingle and dropped in a hollow amidst seaweed and the black-horned shells of skate eggs. There it writhed and writhed, seeking escape from the terrible elements of air and light. It was small-mouthed, silver-frosty, scarcely spotted, a maiden fish, said the fisherman, who did not notice the gold it bore on its pennon-like fin. It flapped and leapt and slapped down on the dry stones until blood broke out of the scales of the slender tail, and it weakened, fast losing its beauty, boring feebly to lie still, dislusted. And after a while it leapt again, slapping away its life on the scalding shingle, seeking with the last of its strength to find the life which it had lost. The fisherman glanced casually at the figure of the man standing still by the fish, and then stooped to the repiling of the net. The poet stood beside the salmon, waiting during the agony and betrayal of the spirit's innocence by forces of life which he knew were irresistible and inevitable. And waiting there, he felt a strange joy arising through his pain, as he beheld the everlasting stream of time which flowed away from the world's end to an immortal sea beyond the dusk of those great night suns called stars. The salmon was scarcely breathing now. It was almost beyond the world's end, where the poet stood with death in his heart. Slowly it lifted up, a curving sigh of farewell to its beauty, and it was ended. The poet stood there, his eyes seeing not the steady glance of the girl beside him, nor anything mortal, as he drowned in a sea deeper than any Atlantic. Upon the shingle the breakers crashed, driven by the gale, to withdraw in white roar of foam. Far out beyond the estuary the sea was dark with peat water of the river in spate. Solid bends of swift water, brown but clear, hid the sills of weirs up the valley. On the hill above his hut stood the poet, watching the last of the sun sinking into the Atlantic, heedless of rain, lightning, wind. He watched dark clouds absorbing the last gleam, and walked down to the lower ground, his head held high, his eyes steady and bright. His work was done, his life fulfilled, and now he might enter the everlasting stream of time beyond the end of the world. The river, faithful to the spirit that breathed upon the face of its waters, creator of life through the symbol of baptism, should bear in the darkness his useless body to the sea's oblivion. He entered his hut and began to arrange papers, books, chair, and cooking pots. The blankets were folded on the bed of ash poles and bracken. The manuscript of his poem, wrapped up, tied with string, addressed, left on the table. A note was written, giving these few belongings and the use of the hut to a younger poet whose work he had encouraged and helped into print. The fire on the hearth was sunken in grey ash and dull embers, a pale flame rising from the peat and sinking against the whitened stones of the hearth. Better to quench the fire before departing. But no. On this last night the virtue and service of fire should be treated with honour. He sat before the wan flames hovering out of the peat, heather of olden time that was yet sunshine and air, and salt of the earth arising again in flame for the service of another form of life. The river's song arose in the night now, glittering with stars, and he waited, serene and joyful in the ultimate triumph of poetry over the world. It became colder towards dawn, and he began to feel a return of doubt and terror, but he resisted the temptation to flinch. The flame was sinking, and soon he would be free to go. A pale visitant was now within the hut, revealing gradually table, walls, bed, floor, the poet's thin hands and knees and feet, the poet's face worn and tranquil, the eyes of which had dreamed beyond hope. The visitant revealed all as surfaces in one dimension. The visitant was dawn. The poet arose and turned to the door. The door was opening of itself. He waited like a dead man. A form appeared before him. Eyes of the sky's clarity looked into his eyes, and in her tender smile the sun's truth flowed to his being, enfeebled by its long and lonely search in the moonlit land of truth. She was smiling. She came close to the poet, who saw her eyes with the colour and truth of the sky. Her hand took his hand and pressed it warmly. Her other hand was held open before him, with the golden star and the silver link. His tears fell, and he bowed his head, and she bent over him tenderly and clasped him. His tears fell, and he bowed his head, and she bent over him tenderly and clasped him. In the eastern sky the morning star Eosphorus, the light-bringer, glowed with its white fires. Joyfully the song of water arose in the valley. The poet looked at the maiden and knew that his search was ended, for on that brow was the sunrise of a new world. The next story is called Trout. Motorists from London know the winding road which leads from Taunton to the sunsets of the west. up hills and round bends with valleys below, twisting and turning above wooded combes and plunging down to cross over little bridges, through villages with ancient names, and at last to the high ridge between beechen hedges where the sombre line of the moor can be seen to the north. As this road upon the ridge begins to descend, the observant motorist may discern in the mists and wooded prospects below him a distant church tower in the shape of an owl, and here is the town of South Dalton. The main road to London, 180 miles eastward, runs through South Dalton. The motorist rolls through its square, and away to the western seaboard with visions of sand and green combers, of Devonshire cream and pleasant nights in the local inns. He is gone, followed by others. The wheels roll westward, away from the town. Few stop there. It is said by the superficial that nothing ever happens in South Dalton, that its golden age departed with the stagecoach and the jingle of harness. Maybe this is so, but before we too pass on, let us for a moment think about Mrs. Horton of Horton, before she is forgotten. The new generation remembers its own events. Who will forget while they live the great event of the roasting of the ox in the marketplace, and in summer too, during the Forces' welcome home reception? 600 people attended, most of them taking but the briefest glance at what was considered to be a gruesome sight, the great coal fire in a brick open-sided box, and the monstrous horned and staring-eyed carcass frizzling on a horizontal bar of iron. The free beer cheered things up a bit when they sat down to trestle tables set out in rows and ate slices of the ox with potatoes and boiled cabbage. Lest the above be interpreted as a criticism of the town council's lack of imagination, let it be said at once that South Dalton, in one respect, is in the van of modernity and progress. It possesses that which exists elsewhere only in the dreams of fly fishermen of modest means, for South Dalton, having acquired the land adjoining half a mile of the main river into which the Horton Brook flowed, then decided that the fishing rights should belong to everybody. Free salmon, sea trout, and brown trout fishing for all comers. God made the fishes for man, and here men, uninhibited by selfish landlord or vested interests, took their rights. The River Dull runs below the town. At the bottom of the hill, the London road is carried by a bridge with a grey stone parapet. The bridge marks the upper limit of the free fishing. Immediately below the bridge is a high weir with a stone apron, sloping too steeply for the ascent of any fish except in an almost phenomenal flood. Salmon and trout running up to spawn are forced to remain below the weir, in the water of the free fishing. And just below the weir stands the inadequate town sewage plant. After that was built, the town council had been able to buy the fishing rights of their half-mile at their own price. Motorists passing down the London road at night slow up at the bridge, for the road bends beyond it. Occasionally one stops, attracted and puzzled by the strange flashing and dancing of lights in the valley below. Scrutiny reveals that the lights are moving apparently in the river itself. Are these the fabled lights of Will-o'-the-Wisp? Surely not, for in addition to the lights are to be heard shouts, accompanied by noises of splashing and beating of the water. There may be a dull explosion and a momentary fountain arising below. The sounds of quarrelling and the snarling of dogs are not unknown in that stretch of the town's free fishing. Here no keeper, hired by selfish capitalist, can prevent men from taking their rights. No water bailiff, hated agent of the Board of Conservators, dare show his face on the bank. Dazed by the little searchlights, the salmon which has run up to spawn, its skin dark brown, its flesh infirm, its body full of milt or eggs, lies close to the bottom of the pool, while gaff or wire noose on long ash-pole is moved nearer the tail, nearer and nearer, gaff just below the ventral fin or noose over the dark square tail. Then jerk! Out he comes. Hiding under a furze bush, my dear, and keep an eye on him, for rogues abound. There are always folk ready to steal the work of honest men. Sometimes, when many fish are lying there, gangs at night blow the pits with gelignite cartridges, killing by concussion everything living in the pool. Sometimes a couple of sportsmen will throw in a large screw-top beer bottle filled with quicklime in a little water and weight it so that it sinks to the bottom. The carbonic acid gas increases until its pressure shatters the bottle, and in its rush to the surface, enough gas is absorbed by the water to poison every fish for scores of yards. Another method is to put an old stocking filled with chloride of lime into the stream. The first mouthful of dissolved chlorine gas passing through delicate gills, the lungs of a fish, causes twisting, leaping torture until the fish turns on its side and floats down to where, on the shallows, hands await to grasp and pitch their spoil on the bank. During days of summer, when the river is dead low and bright, small boys can be observed stalking the few tiny trout, mere fingerlings, that have come up from below. Bare-legged and intent, each with a stick, to which is attached a fine brass wire noose, the boys creep after the darting fish until they are fatigued and cowed. Noose is worked over the tail, jerk, put it in the pocket and go after that other one. Only 4 inches long and ungrown. Yes, but if I don't have 'em, someone else will, so I'll have 'em first. That's right, my boy, you look after yourself. No one else will. A mile away, on the side of a hill, stands a big house, gaunt and unpainted behind the Palladian pillars of its main entrance. Once, life flowed from the big house, as Horton Hall was called, to all the farms around it for many miles. Now at night sometimes a solitary light is to be seen in one of its windows, until 9 o'clock precisely, when the light goes out, and the night is to the ghosts, which are memories. For Horton Hall is one of those English, or it might well be said European, houses which have had their day. Horton awaits demolition for its valuable teak and oak and mahogany doors, its beams and rafters, the lead on its roof, the oak and pitch pine planking of its floors, and the panelling of its walls. Even its stones have a value in the present shortage of every kind of material in Britain. There are several eager builders waiting for the death of Mrs. Horton of Horton, and the sale by auction of that valuable repository of building materials. But the chatelaine of Horton Hall, who has known 4 wars and 5 generations of her family, is still alive. During the Second World War, Horton Hall was occupied by many families evacuated from the towns. The parkland, which had been sold after the First War, was a camp. Concrete roads and paths and scores of squat black huts of tarred corrugated iron and brick, shaped like headless elephants in repose, had taken the place of the beautiful timber trees and the herd of fallow deer. But Mrs. Horton of Horton remained, occupying 4 rooms of the mansion, including the old music room, which faced west and the sloping land to the river. Nearly every morning the old lady made her way to that room, walking by the aid of an ebony stick with an ivory handle, and looked through the wide west window. The scene had long ceased actively to distress her, for she lived almost entirely in her memories. These were by no means sad, for she had a great-grandson who was to her all that had been and was to be. Upon the piano, which had not been tuned or played for many years, stood a large silver photograph frame. Within the frame were several photographs of young men. Each was clad in tweeds, each was holding a fishing rod in one hand and a trout in the other. One morning, when she entered the music-room, Mrs. Horton noticed that the frame was not standing as it should have been, exactly facing the west window. The sight disturbed her, and she said aloud to the air, "Oh, Matilda, pray see that the frame be replaced after polishing exactly as before." Her voice was low, a little tired, and as she spoke she was seeing the face of her lady's maid before her, and she heard the reply, dignified and quiet. "Yes, ma'am, of course the gentleman must always see the river." But Matilda Parker had died at the age of 73, a dozen years before. Mrs. Horton peered at the frame and noticed with agitation that there were finger marks on its rim. She did not see that they were small finger marks, as of a boy's hands, and she was moving to the wire bell-pull beside the door when she remembered in time that there would be nobody in the servants' hall to answer it. How foolish of her! Of course, the house was now divided into 5 parts, 4 of them occupied by the young wives and families of Royal Air Force officers, stationed at the airfield beyond the river and the valley, on level ground on which once had stood 3 of the Horton farms. Nevertheless, she was disturbed. Could Mr. Ridd the ironmonger have called again, and taken the frame in his hands to remark on it? How had he come into the room? As a fact, Mr. Ridd, the ironmonger of South Dalton, had last come to see Mrs. Horton more than 30 years before. Mr. Ridd had called at Horton Hall shortly after the opening of the fishing season one March to express his deep sorrow at the captain's death, as proper a young gentleman as ever whipped water with rod and line. And then, in his nervousness, he had taken the photograph frame with its embossed coat armour off the piano, and after staring at it with an expression of dolour, had respectfully suggested that if at any time Madam would like a few trout for her breakfast, he would be only too willing to catch them for her, just for the sport of it, if she understood his meaning. Mrs. Horton had entirely understood Mr. Ridd's meaning, and graciously she had thanked Mr. Ridd, saying that it was most kind of Mr. Ridd to have offered his services, but at the moment. Mr. Ridd had left almost hurriedly and gone out to his Ford van, standing in the courtyard of the empty stables behind the mansion, wondering if the old girl had made arrangements to let the fishing. Mrs. Horton had no intention of letting the fishing, certainly not to Mr. Ridd. The way the fellow had handled the frame, turning it about, peering at it from various angles, and then the cunning look in his eyes as he had revealed the true purpose of his visit. In truth, Mr. Ridd, a keen fly fisherman, had not called for the purpose of getting some fishing for himself. When he had come into the presence of the old lady and had seen the photographs in the frame, an awful doubt had entered into him that she might think he had only pretended to sympathy, that her son in the Royal Flying Corps had been killed in order to get some trouting. Mr. Ridd's sympathy had been genuine. He had admired the tall, handsome figure of the captain, and the fine way he could throw a dry fly, as though he were able to know how a fish felt, with the delicacy and lightness of one of the hatching water-flies rising from the surface of the stream. And Mr. Ridd, talking it over with his wife at breakfast of bacon, egg, and sausage that morning, had almost convinced himself that by offering to supply Mrs. Horton's table with trout, he was doing so solely as a tribute to her bereavement and loneliness. On the occasion of Mr. Ridd's visit, the silver frame had contained 3 photographs and the space for a 4th. The 2 lower photographs were of the kind known as snapshots, while the uppermost was a faded daguerreotype. Each was identical in subject and composition: a young man, a rod, and a fish. The uppermost portrait was entirely of a past age. That is to say, it had been taken when Alethea Horton, an heiress in her own right, had been a child. The details were nearly but not entirely obscured by the fadings of time. There was the figure of her father-in-law, Major Horton, wearing a small, close-fitting, small-peaked cap, with high lapels to his jacket and tight knickerbockers and high fawn gaiters. With a magnifying glass the beholder might just discern a face with the incipient moustaches and beard and whiskers of a youth in mid-Victorian times. He held a 14-foot green heart rod in one hand, a 2-pound trout in the other, a couple of fingers through one of its gills. He had been killed soon afterwards with the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. Below the daguerreotype was an early photograph, faded and yellow, of his son, who married Alethea Horton, thus joining two landed estates and conjoining his coat armour with that of his heiress bride. Following the family tradition, the youth in the Norfolk jacket, holding an 11-foot rod with a 10-ounce fish, had in due course become a soldier who, leaving wife and small son at Horton Hall, had died of enteric fever in the South African War. The third photograph was that of the son, taken while still a schoolboy. He wore a straw boater and a jacket of Donegal tweed, while his rod was a 9-foot length of split cane, with which he had taken his first fish, a somewhat lean half-pounder. The First World War had taken him, and with most of his generation he had found his grave in that immense desolation of linked shell-holes stretching from North Flanders to the downland country of Artois and Picardy. But before his death, as an observer in the balloon section of the Royal Flying Corps, he had married a girl serving with the Red Cross, and she had had a son who had grown up never having seen or been seen by his father. The boy had gone to the same school which many generations of Hortons had attended, and like them he had learned to fish for trout with an artificial fly. In due course a fourth photograph had been added to the three others in the frame. The fish had been a 6-ounce trout, taken on a 3-ounce rod of split cane 8 feet long, and likewise in due course he had found a soldier's grave, far from his native land, in action with his regiment of the Royal Armoured Corps, the 17th Lancers, the Death or Glory boys, in the desert warfare with the Africa Corps. After her grandson's death, Mrs. Horton had kept his rod and tackle for his son. This was the boy who had returned on holiday from school the day before our story began, with Mrs. Horton peering at the finger marks on her silver frame. The boy's hands had been greasy, for the first thing he had done after returning home was to rub his enamelled and tapered silk line with a piece of wash leather on which was some paraffin wax, in order to make the line float when he went fishing on the morrow. Somewhat nervously the boy had surveyed the blank space in the family picture record, and wondered if he would be there with his first trout, and if it would be the biggest of them all, before the Easter holidays were over. The declining weights and conditions of those fish in the photographs might have suggested to a philosophical ichthyologist a parallel in decline of the human scene and substance at Horton Hall. For the same changes in human values had affected both land and river equally. These changes had been accepted by nearly everyone as the changes due to modern progress. Soon after the death of the husband of Alethea Horton, the road running through the valley above the stream had been metalled and tarred for the new motor traffic, which was gradually replacing the horse and the iron-shod wooden wheel. From off the sealed surfaces, laid to keep down dust, rainwater drained quickly into the river, causing it to rise and fall swiftly, and so to scour the gravel beds which were the homes of the creepers and nymphs on which the trout fed. In addition to this disturbance, deadly tar acids poisoned the microscopic life, the daphnia and plankton on which the new-hatched trout fry fed. After some years, and much endeavour to remedy injustice, deadly tar was replaced by harmless bitumen as a stone-binding surface. But by then, increased drainage had caused other pollution. The fish found little on which to feed, for the gravelly bottom was silted, and most of the nymphs and other delicate water life that can exist only in pure water had vanished. Lacking natural food, the bigger fish became cannibals, before slow starvation came upon them. A few were to be seen day after day in the same places, growing leaner and blacker, until they disappeared. Only the occasional ring of a small rising fish broke the smooth flow of the water in the clear light of morning and the mellow dusk of a midsummer evening. No mayflies arose and danced over the pools, no dark sedge-flies sped and whirled over the runs at night. The silt absorbed oxygen faster than the stream could replace it from the air, in bubbles broken by every fall and run and jabble and stony shallow. In vain the unhappy owner took legal action, pleading that the chronic pollution contravened the Rivers Pollution Act and the Public Health Acts. In vain samples of river water were taken in the presence of witnesses and put into bottles which were then sealed before being analyzed, and chemist reports offered as evidence in courts of law. Technically, pollution in some cases was proved, but no damages were awarded. The pollution continued as before. It was cheaper for the offending factories to face further summonses for pollution than to spend money to install filter beds and tanks. With the building of more houses, the pollution increased, but the owner did not lose heart. Little dams of tree trunks were made in the hope that high-water winter spates would cause turbulence to sweep away the deadly silt. In spring, new water plants were introduced, in the hope that while growing in sunlight they might absorb the noxious carbon dioxide gas and release the oxygen which was the life of the stream, by which all things breathed. More trout were turned into the water. The Horton estate, once of flourishing farms held by a sturdy tenantry maintaining the fertility of the farms and looking to the squire for leadership in all things, had likewise declined. Agricultural depression, caused by importation of cheap foreign food, had been interrupted by wars, which at base were trade wars. Every death in the family succession meant that a large sum had to be found to pay the death duties to a government which was composed almost exclusively of those serving and served by the trading interests. Death duties could be met only by the sale of farm lands. When all the land had of necessity been sold off, only the park and mansion remained. Further taxation caused the park and its splendid timber to be sold. A syndicate of speculators, interested only in making money, bought the park and sold the trees to a timber merchant, who forthwith felled them and dragged the trunks away. A milk canning factory was built where the old grist mill had stood by the stream. Its effluence finally killed the last of the weary trout. A gasworks did the rest. Birds forsook the banks. The last kingfisher flashed across the bends in the meadow. The last heron flapped away from water which even eels had left. Rows of box-like houses, built of concrete with asbestos roofs, grew where once fallow deer had grazed. Modernity had come right up to the walls of the hall. A fence of galvanized wire set with concrete posts, and a macrocarpa hedge growing rapidly, as though with wild desire to hide with its greenery the change without, enclosed the unpainted mansion and its 4 acres of gardens, which were too costly to keep up. Slowly a wilderness of weeds arose there, until the council rented the gardens for a nominal sum as allotments for whomsoever in South Dalton wanted an allotment. That was in the 30s, when the money value of English land was lower than it had been in its known history. The better to inspect the photographs every morning, Mrs. Horton polished the lenses of her spectacles on a piece of silk, which had lived in its special ivory box on the chimney-piece of the music-room for nearly 30 years. The constant friction against glass, gentle though it had been, had so worn the silk that it looked as if it would be getting its life anew from the silkworm. In her care of that piece of silk, in her fidelity to it, might be seen the source of the old woman's fortitude to conserve what was left, after the ruin of another war, for her great-grandson. The fragment of silk had been part of a white, shining strength that swung a man slowly to earth below the observation balloon from which he had jumped at a telephone message of "Hun over" from the group frenziedly winding in the hauling gear below. And having jumped and tugged at the release cord, he had been pulled up with a jerk and flung about, knowing while he swung upon the wild beats of his heart that he was safe. The wind was taking him away from the slanting cable of the balloon. His fellow observer had jumped after him and was 200 feet above, between himself and the balloon. Then the skirl and crack of shrapnel was joined by the hiss and clack of machine-gun bullets from above and below. He watched the vague, smoky line of tracers passing diagonally by the balloon, surely through it, and, yes, there was a slow curl of flame from its top. Then he saw the Hun, an albatross, make an Immelman turn, only to dive away to hedge-hop back to Hunland. And looking up, he saw 2 Sopwith camels following the Hun down and shooting at him. The bullets passed near. The claquement made his ears ring and sing, until a terrific shock made him feel himself to be very far away as he swung gently under the parachute, so gently that the sensation of swinging changed to one of gliding, then to a rippling as of the surface of a river. As he listened, he could hear under the gentle noises of the stream on the gravelly shallows the singing of the water ouzel. He saw the little sturdy black-and-white bird perching on a mossy stone at the tail of the pool where the water ran clear and fast. He saw his father beside him and felt the excitement of trying a dry fly for the first time. He saw the spinners of the olive duns rising and falling over the stream in the June evening. He saw the females descending to drop the eggs from their long whisks into the water. He heard the sip-sucking noises of trout, invisible in the fast runs, as imperceptibly they thrust up their nebs while sucking in the spent flies. He saw himself crouching beside his father on the edge of the gravel under the bank, and heard his reassuring, "You'll get him, take your time, be easy." He felt clumsy. The fly would catch in the alders in front or in the thistles on the meadow behind. He was nervous because father was there, and as in a dream he drew out line while working the rod to and fro until the tiny hackled fly was passing overhead, and as he measured the distance to the rising trout with his eye, he felt himself suddenly to be his father, and then he was casting exactly as father did. He shot his line, and tapered cast, and brown hackled fly out straight and light. The fly dropped almost dreamily on the quiet, bubble-riding water beside the mossy stone where the trout lay. The fly fell lightly, and rode down beside a bubble. The neb of a fish arose and quietly sucked in the fly. A light jerk of his wrist, and the tiny hook was driven into the corner of the trout's mouth. The fish dashed downstream. The rod bent. The fish leapt, shaking its head, and he saw the red spots on its golden-brown length. Careful lest it break away, for the last 2 links of the cast were single horsehair. He played the trout for at least 5 minutes before it turned on its side, dead beat. His first fish. Quick, the spring balance, before it lost weight by drying. Father had never got a trout of more than 8 ounces that season. He looked so beautiful he wanted to put it back into the river, but when it flapped nearer the edge of the grassy bank, he grabbed it in alarm. As he was working the hook from the bony mouth, the hook suddenly grew very big and fixed itself in his own mouth, attached to a monstrous line which tore at his jaw. He cried out for father, but father was gone. He could not find father. He cried out, "Mother!" for the river was roaring. It was swelling and turning red. The line dragged violently at his head, so terribly violently that he was dragged farther and farther from himself, until at last something snapped, and after that everything was dim and unsubstantial and fading into vacancy. From below they watched the cable whipping and coiling on the ground, dragging down in a smoking tangle of rope and wicker basket the body of the observer and his torn parachute. Later they sent to his mother, together with his personal belongings, a piece of the silk and a photograph of his grave at Ervillers. That had been in 1917. Since then there had been another grave in the desert of North Africa. But there was also another Nigel, just home from school for the Easter holidays and eager to catch his first fish. All the eldest Horton sons, back to the Tudors and beyond, had borne the name of Nigel. But where could Nigel fish? Granny had been wondering about it, and in the end had remembered Mr. Jones, who once had mentioned something about the free fishing below the London road. Mr. Jones was known as a taxi driver. This was a misnomer in some respects, for Mr. Jones's motor car was not fitted with a taximeter, and it was, moreover, a Rolls-Royce. Licensed to carry 6 passengers, certainly, but, well, no more need be said except that the Silver Ghost chassis dated from 1914, and that its first owner had been the chatelaine of Horton Hall. The present owner-driver of the elderly motor car was by name Jones, but he was prepared to resent anyone calling him by that name, especially any old die-hard Tory. Most of his fares called him either Nothing or Mr. Jones or Charlie. But Jones, he wouldn't have any of that, especially any old geezer who never spent more than a couple of quid a year with him. To the South Dalton free fishing went Mrs. Horton and her great-grandson Nigel on the 2nd day of the Easter holidays. They arrived in Mr. Jones's motor. After the rather long business of the old lady removing herself with the aid of her ebony walking-stick from the back of the landau, the two began to move towards the bank. Mr. Jones walked behind them, carrying, at Mrs. Horton's request, the tea-basket, Mr. Nigel's rod, and a landing net. Mr. Jones, who was not, it need hardly be said, a native of South Dalton, but a comparatively recent immigrant, thought as he puffed at his fag that he didn't mind carrying the rod to oblige the dame, but as far as he was concerned he wasn't going to Mr. no blooming boy, or man either for that matter. Mr. Nigel! Mr. his foot! For 2 pins he'd call a kid Nigel. He didn't need their 2 quid a year. Mrs. Horton of Horton, indeed. Why, the place was falling down. He could buy them up if he liked. The party of 3 stopped by the river bank. The water ran clear over stones with sandy scours at the eddies, for the outfall of the sewage plant was below, hidden by trees. Unspeaking, with a faint smile, the driver handed the hollow bamboo rod case to the boy. "I say, Gran, this is the Palacoma split cane that Daddy killed his first fish with, isn't it? It's wizard. Look, it's a hexagon pattern, Mr. Jones. They're awfully hard to get now. Bailey Martin at school says it's the best rod for small streams in the world." Pleased with the way he had been addressed, Mr. Jones watched the eager fingers attaching the reel and drawing out line to pass it through the rings. Despite the rubbing with paraffin wax and wash leather, the line was tacky with age and seemed reluctant to leave the spool. "Now I believe I ought to have kept it on the line-dryer," the old lady remarked, watching the boy's actions intently through her lorgnette. "I recollect your grandfather always kept his lines between the pages of a copy of the Times every year until the season opened again. I do hope you will find the flies of use, dear. I don't suppose the change of fashion in flies is so marked as in other things." Her voice quavered a little. She was lost a while, but recovered herself and saw the boy before her once again. The boy and the man were examining the several variegated objects in their little compartments, each with its minute hinged mica lid that flipped open at a touch. "Now I wonder which flies you should use," the frail voice inquired with careful distinctiveness of tone. "Your grandfather was always saying something about wet flies and dry flies. Now, what is the difference, I wonder?" "Bailey Martin always swears by the dry fly, Gran. He says he's a dry fly purist and would never think of fishing wet." As a fact, the 14-year-old boy referred to as a dry fly purist had never caught any fish bigger than a salmon parr, that voracious 6-inch snap-all that floats and swims fish, looking like a trout but with dark fingerprints on its side, and his fishing had been confined to the moorland stream of his Cumberland home. But Bailey Martin was a great reader, and lived mainly in the imagination. "A pity Bailey Martin isn't here," observed Mr. Jones. "Myself, I'm a worm purist. None of this whipping water for me. When the river's in flood and muddy, that's the time to yank 'em out." "Don't you think that, as at the moment the water has the appearance of what used to be described as gin clear," remarked the old lady, "it might be as well to try a dry fly?" "Well, others may be a better judge of gin than what I be," retorted the driver, looking up at the sky and wishing that his pals in the ring of bells could hear him. "Now, will you please be so good as to tell Mr. Nigel which are the dry flies and which are the wet, Mr. Jones?" Mr. Jones was so relieved at the obvious respect shown to himself that he replied earnestly, "I'm sorry, I don't know, ma'am, but maybe one's so good as another. To tell you the honest truth, ma'am, I've watched them as knows putting on a fly and taking it off again and trying others, and when they weren't no good, whipping 'em off again and picking out another, quizzing it and putting it back, sticking it into their hat until they looked like fly paper. Never satisfied as a fly fisherman. I don't wonder either, when you come to think of it. All these colours ain't natural. Look at this one." He dropped a minute and delicate affair of red and green peacock feather, silk, varnish, and steel into his palm and held it out. "What fish is going to recognise that as anything he's seen before? And this, what natural fly, in a manner of speaking, has 2 white wings and a lot of ginger whiskers growing out of its body?" He turned to the boy. "See? I ask you. But a worm's a worm all the world over, and the natural food of a fish, if you see my meaning." Nigel, conscious of his school motto, "Manners maketh man," smiled pleasantly, but he thought, "A wormer. I wonder if this fly is meant to represent a worm?" he asked, picking up an object of fluffy cinnamon with a double hook. Mr. Jones gave it a glance and said emphatically, "No, that's an eel fly, for the eel has a double lock to its jaws and can wriggle out of one hook but never 2. Nigel thought this an odd explanation, for according to the coloured plates in his book, it was a Scottish loch fly for big trout. "I should try this one if I were you," advised Mr. Jones, picking up a mayfly. "It's a juicy mouthful." As he spoke, the stub of a cigarette was wagging about on his lower lip. "Yes, Nigel," said Mrs. Horton, "I am sure that Mr. Jones is right about the choice of fly being not of the greatest importance. Your grandfather used to say, I remember, that to fish with the fly you believe in is 9/10 of the way to persuading a fish to believe in it also." "How about this red and green joker?" asked Mr. Jones. "Here, give us the gut." "I say thank you so much, but I can tie it on," assured the boy, struggling to conceal his anxiety. "I know the turtle knot. Bailey Martin swears that's the best." "I've nearly done it now," said the driver. "Thank you," replied Nigel politely, while his lip trembled. "There you are, my lad," exclaimed Mr. Jones, flipping the fly away on the gut leader with his finger and thumb. At the same time he loosened the cigarette from his lower lip, and, neatly using an expulsion of air compressed within his cheeks, flipped the stub into the river. At that moment a salmon rolled up to the top of the pool, showed a yellow-grey blur as it turned, and went under again. "There! Did you see that, Nigel?" he cried, pointing to the water. "A blooming great fish come up and nosed it. Quick, chuck your fly in the same place." "I saw it, Gran! A salmon!" cried the boy. He dropped the fly box in his excitement, and went on his hands and knees to seek the flies which had shot out of some of the compartments. "Oh, curse! Just my luck!" "Here, try this white-winged thing," suggested Mr. Jones. "After all, the fag end was white." "Yes, why not take Mr. Jones's advice, Nigel? The rise may be over at any moment. I remember your grandfather used to say a rise might begin suddenly and end as suddenly." "Some water whippers use several flies at once," said the driver, when he had tied the red and green Alexandra to the end of the cast. "That's your tail fly. I'll tie white wings above it." He snapped a length of gut from the cast. "That's all right, don't worry, I'll tie again. Have it hanging like this, see, on a bit by itself. That's called a dropper. One more on top, anyone will do. That's your tickler. Here, you tie it, and I'll find a worm to shove on for luck." He began kicking up the turf, ceasing as another man came through the gate at the top of the slope, carrying a rod case in one hand and a net in the other. "Ah, here's Mr. Ridd," cried Mrs. Horton. "He'll be able to tell us what is the best fly to use, I have no doubt." Jones abruptly ceased his prospecting for worms, and standing up, stretched his arm, pushed back his driver's cap, yawned, and sought a cigarette. Another old-fashioned codger. Mr. Ridd's respectful pleasure in meeting Mrs. Horton and Master Nigel at the river was genuine. Any eager mental pictures he had had of getting a salmon with his new American stainless steel 3-foot rod, using a small bronze Devon spinner on a threadline of gut substitute on a Pfluger spinning reel, were put aside. This new outfit, given him by an American officer after a day's fishing together, was capable of throwing a minnow weighing an ounce for great distances, and of dropping it within a foot of where he wanted to drop it. With such a rod and reel, the American expert had cast well upriver and worked the minnow downstream in a deadly manner which had taken several sea trout and a salmon in one afternoon, while Mr. Ridd had caught nothing. He had received the outfit by post that morning as a parting gift from the American officer who was going back to the States. All the morning Mr. Ridd had been awaiting 1 o'clock, for it was the day of South Dalton's early closing. But now, seeing Mrs. Horton by the riverside, and apprehending her gracious request for advice, Mr. Ridd forgot his ambition in a desire to be of service. Immediately he declared that the red and green, silver-bodied Alexandra was no good. It might be all right in Blagden Reservoir near Bristol, but it was useless in the present water. The coachman was no good either. All right for the late evening, with its white wings, but not a bit of use during the day. As for the bob-fly, goodness gracious, wherever did it come from? A proper Irish sea-trout loch-lure. A Parson Hughes it looked like, or it might be a fiery Forbes, or even a local variation of grouse and claret. Off it came. What he would recommend was one or another of the pale wateries. Finally, Mr. Ridd selected a blue upright, a cowdung, and a cocky bonthu, which he pronounced cocky bundy for the bob-fly. A cocky bundy, he explained, was a Welsh beetle found near Bracken, and was a killing fly all the year. You couldn't beat a cocky bundy. "I'll bet it don't beat a worm," remarked Mr. Jones. "Mr. Jones has a single-minded faith in worms," said the old lady, and Mr. Ridd nodded politely in agreement. He, too, fished the worm in coloured water. It was catch as catch can on the free fishing,